All right, so carrying on from where we were talking about doing our event checks, if we have an event check that results in combat, you're going to follow the following steps. Now, listed on our sequence of play, you can see it does list down combat, and you're going to start with your command skill check. Check to determine the range, generate your wounds, and then resolve the total attack. Now, you're going to do your command skill check like usual here at the start of combat because your squad leader, again, does not have any combat skills. He doesn't get to attack at the fire or the melee range. So all he can do is generate success levels with his command skill that he can use to either affect the range of the combat by +or-1, or he can apply his command skill points towards his troops, increasing their chances for a success level, or even giving them bonus success levels depending on the random number they generate. So barring special circumstances where the range will already be determined for you, you're going to look at your range table here on the enemy sheet to determine the range of the combat. And you can see that it has 3 different columns here. And that has to do with the fact that when you are first setting the range for combat, you're going to use the first column. And then if the combat has already been at melee range or fire range, you will use whichever column is appropriate. So if in our example here, our squad was located at this node and had an A result for a combat result, they would roll under the set column to determine what range the combat would be at. On a result of a 0 to a 2, it would be at melee range, and at a 3 or higher, it would be at a fire range. Again, you do need to keep in mind that you can use that command skill point to take and increase this or decrease it by 1 to affect the range in a direction that you would prefer that it go. Okay, so let's say that we had generated a single type 1 enemy for this node. We could place a marker down to remind ourselves that there's a single type 1. We are going to be at the fire range in our example, and there's a counter for that as well that you can set down to remind yourself that you are at fire range. And this is the point at which you're going to generate wounds. Now, the generation of all wounds, whether it's from your squad or from the enemies, is going to happen simultaneously. So it's unless there's something like an ambush situation that affects that, generally speaking, combat will be handled simultaneously. So you'll generate the total amount of wounds for your squad, the total amount of wounds for the enemy, and then apply them back and forth. Something else you do need to keep in mind is when it comes to specialists like our demolitionist here, you can see he does have a combat skill in melee, but demolitionists or any other specialist can only participate in combat if there are more than 3 enemies or less than 3 of your basic troops. So if you only had a couple of fire teams, then you could potentially use your specialist. Or if you had a huge squad of enemies, then you could generate success levels. But generally speaking, your specialists are not going to contribute when it comes to combat. Okay, so I've gathered up a couple of our squad members here to show you an example when it comes to performing combat actions and generating your wounds. You're going to look at whichever is the appropriate stat. Again, for us, we're at the fire stat, so ranged combat. So we would generate success levels for this fire team using the number 4. And we would do it the same way we generate any other success levels. Roll a random number and then divide that number by this skill, dropping in your remainder, and that would be the amount of success levels that you do have. So that's how many wounds that the individual squad member generates. You will have some specialized squad members like this sniper who, when it comes to the fire range, has 2 numbers listed, and that's going to be handled by rolling twice when it comes to their fire range. So you'll generate a success level for the 3 and then generate success levels for the 4. You'll roll for each one of those numbers. And if you wanted to affect it with a command skill point, you could only affect one of the rolls. You couldn't use a single command point to increase both of those rolls as an example. Once you had generated the wounds that your squad had performed during their combat, you can just set them to the side for the moment, and then you can generate wounds in the exact same fashion for the enemy troops that were generated during the combat. We see for this mercenary soldier, they have a fire skill of 4. Same way, do a random number generation, divide, see how many success levels, and that's how many wounds that they'll generate towards your squad. Now, when it comes to wounds that the enemy generates that go towards your squad members, you can allocate those in any way that you desire. You can spread them out. You can bunch them up all on one single unit if you want. You can assign those wounds however you want to your own troops. When it comes to the wounds that you generate to the enemy, though, they'll be handled a little bit differently. You can assign a maximum of half the total number of wounds, rounding down, to a single enemy unit, and then the rest must be spread out as evenly as possible. So as an example, if you had 3 enemies and you had generated 4 wounds, at most you could give 2 wounds to a single enemy and then 1 wound each to the other 2 remaining enemies. Now, we're going to get into the special rules like armor or armor piercing in a later on video, but once all wounds had been assigned to your squad and to the enemies, if there were any enemies remaining after all wounds had been resolved, then you're going to start another round of combat.